Many years ago, when I lived in Boston, I used to take the subway back and forth to work. Now, I don't know if any of you have done that, but when you take public transportation consistently, you begin to become familiar with the people around you. If nothing else, people watching is great on public transit. You get to see the people who are prepared and going to work and can stand there holding on to a bar and reading a newspaper at the same time. You see the people who are nervous. You see the people who are probably coming home instead of going out. You see the world on public transportation. And sooner or later, you start nodding to the people that you see every day. Well, when I was taking the subway to work every day when I lived in Boston, I eventually noticed this woman who was often on the subway car with me. The most noticeable thing about her really was her invisibility. She did everything she could to make sure no one would notice her. She always had a hat pulled down low. She always wore a dark jacket. She kind of hunched herself up in her seat. And she always had a cooler on her lap, which seemed very odd to me. It was one of those igloo coolers, so blue plastic, kind of scuffed up with a white lid. It was the kind of plastic where if you were to bump it into something, it was thick and sturdy, so it might just get a little rough around the edges, but it was one of those coolers that would never, ever break. And she always had it with her. It was always on her lap or in her arms. It had a handle and wheels, so I'm sure she could have rolled it along behind her when she got off of the subway, always two stops before the stop I got off at. But she always clutched it close. And I began to wonder. Now, when you're on the subway, you know that it's very poor etiquette to stare at someone. So everything I could glean about her was just through little glances, looking above her, below her, looking at her for a moment, hoping she wouldn't notice me. But my curiosity got bigger and bigger and bigger, and I just had to find out what was going on. I'm sure she had noticed me too. Occasionally we would nod at each other in that stranger nodding at stranger you see every day kind of way, but she gave no inclination that she wanted to be friends. Now, when I was a little kid, I read The Little Prince. And in The Little Prince, there are very clear instructions about taming, about doing the same thing at the same time every day and getting a little bit closer each time. There are folk tales about that too. And so I decided that I would take this advice and run with it. At first, I started standing just a little bit closer to where she was each day. And then I started sitting down on the other side of the subway car, so we were facing each other, and I would always smile and nod at her, and she would smile and nod and look away. And then one day there was an open seat next to her, so I sat down next to her and I said, "Man, this weather, huh?" She said, "Yeah, the weather," and kind of leaned away from me, though there aren't many places to go on a subway car. So I didn't say much after that. I just sat near her. I smiled. And I figured if she was going to be tamed, she would be tamed. And if not, well, I did the best I could. One day when we came rattling into her stop, she stood up holding on to that cooler, and I kind of stumbled a little. I caught her. I grabbed her shoulders to make sure she wouldn't fall. And she turned around and said, "Thank you, granddaughter," and walked off the train. Granddaughter. I didn't know her. Why was she calling me granddaughter? But then the next day when I sat next to her, she said, "Well, I suppose you are wondering why I called you granddaughter." And the doors opened. And I said, "Well, yes, I was. I mean, it was a nice thing to hear, but not what I expected." Hmm. She started to tell me a story. It took several train rides for her to tell me the whole thing. But this is more or less what she said. "I called you granddaughter because you are my granddaughter. Every woman is my granddaughter. I have been alive for a long, long time. I was created as an irresistible punishment. The gods gave me all of the gifts they could. They gave me beauty of face and figure. They gave me wit and humor. They gave me curiosity. You see, the gods were so angry at man. Zeus was so angry at man. Prometheus and his brother, they had made everything, including men made out of clay, men who walked around and did little more other than babble at each other and worship Zeus, which was all Zeus really wanted. It's all the gods ever want, to be worshipped. And men at the beginning, they were incapable of little else. But then Prometheus, oh, Prometheus, dear, sweet Prometheus, he began to give men gifts, tools, clothing, shelter, and then fire. You know the story. You know what Zeus did to poor Prometheus up there on the mountain, his liver torn out again and again and again. I have never eaten liver, and I never will, she said. Poor Prometheus. But it wasn't enough. It is never enough for Zeus to punish. Zeus must do it again and again and again. He is cruel, if nothing else. And so he decided that the men who were no longer worshiping him should be punished as well. And so he made me. Excuse me for just a moment. Thank you. He made me beautiful and funny and kind. He gave me all of the gifts all of the gods did, and then he gave me a jar and said, "You must not open this. Now off to earth with you." The men all fell in love with me. Of course they did. How could they not? There had never been a woman before. And while they had loved one another, now they had me to love as well. And it was all well and good for a time. But being worshipped grows boring. How many times can someone massage your feet in a day? And so I didn't think of the jar. And I didn't think of the jar. And I didn't think of the jar until I opened it. You know the story. But what the tellers of the tale never include, because they were not there, is how terrible it was when the jar was opened. At first, nothing happened. And then there was an echoing inside of the jar, so I peered in, and it was when I looked in that with a great roar and a tremendous wind, all of the ills of the world came tumbling out. The writers of the stories did not know how it smelled when death came out of the jar. The thickness of the aroma that stuck inside of my sinuses coated my teeth. They didn't know the grimness, the grim feeling, the great cold that swept over me when disease came. And when jealousy came, the terrible grim satisfaction that I felt as it seeped into all of my pores. All of the ills of the world came out of that jar. I tried desperately to put the lid on. I pushed it on with all of my might, but the wind was so great. War, famine, hunger, disease. And finally, when I was able to push the lid back onto the jar, I pushed it with all of my might, and it caught one last ill, which tugged on itself until it broke in half, and some remained in the jar. And so hope was loosed into the world. I know that some of you humans, when you think of this story, you think that hope is a good thing, is it not? We need hope to survive, but bitter hope, broken hope, unfulfilled hope. Oh, Zeus was wily indeed to put hope down at the bottom of the jar. So when it came out, we would think that all would be well, but I saved the worst of it inside. You do not want to know what the kind of hope that is left within the jar is like. It is bad enough that you know what it is to have hopes unfulfilled. She shrugged. And that is my story, she said. That is what is here. The jar in a box, in soft wrapping, in the cooler. I gave up death so that the jar would never be opened. I take it with me everywhere so no one will ever find it and unleash that worst of ills into the world. I did give the world one good thing, though, she said. Where would humans be without curiosity, without wonder? It is because of me that you have dreamt and learned and grown and discovered. I know that you are curious about what might be in here, and I will not show you. But curiosity is a gift that Zeus was incapable of giving to humankind. Well, she said, now you know. It's my stop. I hope you have a good day. And she stood up, clutching that cooler, and made her way off the train. And I didn't know whether to believe her or not. I watched as she left, and I watched as the train pulled away. I could see her walking down the platform, hugging the cooler to her. And I thought first that she was mad, and then I thought maybe she wasn't. But you meet so many strange people on the subway. I kept seeing her on the subway, and we would smile and nod to one another, but it was as if she knew that I didn't know what to say, and so she never invited me to sit next to her. I couldn't help wondering about that box. Was there really a jar in a box wrapped in blankets inside that cooler, and inside that jar was there really something even more terrible than the rest? I couldn't stop thinking about it. And I watched her over and over again on the subway, watched as she walked, wondered if maybe I could somehow create a fall where the box might open. I was so curious. It was eating me up inside. I talked to my boss and I changed the time that I came into work. I rode a later subway. I never saw her again. I really do think that Pandora gets a bad rap. All right, that was one. This next is a set of several interwoven stories. This is the long part of this. So if you need to stretch or get a little bit of water, now would be a good time to do so. Okay. He was a man who loved his sons. If he could have chosen why we would remember him, we would be remembering him for love. Not for cleverness, not for what he could create, not for the mistakes he made and the things that he left done behind him. We would remember him for how much he loved his sons. His eldest was Eopix, and he wanted Eopix to do what he did, to become a builder, a craftsman, a draftsman, an engineer, to create something out of nothing. And so he pushed his son in that direction, even though the boy said over and over again, "Father, that is not my calling. I want to be a healer." But Daedalus could hear no such thing, and instead tried again and again to make his boy be someone other than who he was meant to be. And so in time, when Eopix was a young man, he kissed his younger brother goodbye and left, never to see his father again. Eopix did become a healer of great renown, but his story is not for this telling. When his son left, Daedalus's heart shattered. He had loved his older boy so much. He'd wanted only to guide his son in a direction that he thought would do well for him in the world, but now he realized that, oh, it had all been a mistake. If only he had listened. And so he held Icarus closer to him, and spoiled his son as much as he could. If there was anything Icarus wanted, he would do his best to give it to him. It didn't matter who Icarus would be when he grew up. All that mattered was that he knew he was loved. And for a time, Daedalus was content. Eventually, word came to him that his nephew Talus had shown talent as a maker of things, and the boy was sent to him to apprentice under him. And Talus was remarkable. He could build anything, it seemed. He was so young and so talented. It was a delight for Daedalus to guide this young man in his own footsteps, knowing that this young man would someday be a remarkable builder of things. But Talus was too good. If Daedalus created a little figure that could walk, Talus's figure could walk and talk. If Daedalus created a way for hot water to be brought to the home, Talus created a way where hot and cold water would come and could mingle in a fresh basin. No matter what Daedalus did, Talus exceeded him. He told himself that his heart should be delighted, that there was someone young who would exceed him someday, but the thought of being exceeded ate away at him. And they were on a walk one day, watching the curls of the waves, talking about how waves formed, and whether Talus stumbled or Daedalus pushed him. The young man fell off the cliff and died. Daedalus was exiled from his home. He and Icarus had to leave. Word spread that Daedalus was no longer living where he was, and King Minos of Crete invited him to come live with him there. Minos was delighted to have the greatest engineer of his lifetime living there, and Daedalus made so many things for Minos. He made him little entertaining toys, birds that could whistle and flap their wings. He built him a great palace. He did so many things for Minos, and as long as Icarus, Daedalus' son, was treated with love and respect and given what he needed, Daedalus was content. Minos decided that he must do more, and so he did. My husband married me for my beauty. Never mind my intelligence, my grace, my creativity, my capacity to think and feel and do. All he cared about was having the most beautiful queen. And my husband was a brutal man. My skin knew the shape of his palm more than any other touch. And when we stood in front of the people and they chanted out cheers for King Minos and Queen Pasiphae, well, I felt only bitterness as I stood by his side. The king was a beast, and I was his chattel, but I was something he possessed, and he yearned to possess more. So he prayed to Poseidon for a great bull that he could sacrifice to find favor with Poseidon. Being on an island in the sea, Poseidon was the god my husband most spoke with. And so he prayed, and Poseidon sent him an exquisite white bull. A bull without flaw on its coat, on its hooves, a bull of absolute perfection. And my husband enjoyed possessing perfect things. So he kept the bull. He had another one slain. And so it was that it all began. Soon enough, Poseidon found out what my husband had done. And as you know as well as I, when the gods give gifts, they want them back. They want those gifts to be used in the way they were intended. And Poseidon was outraged that my husband, had not sacrificed the bull. And so he set about whispering in my ear, a breeze across my cheek that sounded like words, a dream that I woke up from, barely remembered, the sounds of the waves crashing on the shore, all told me something, and I was filled with a curiosity to see the great white bull from the sea. I could hear it bellowing all the time. It hated being on the island. It hated not having served its purpose. And so I went to see it, him. The bull was in an enclosure, bellowing out, roaring out its dissatisfaction, tossing his horns back and forth. So his keepers were tossed out of the enclosure. And when I stepped in, they rushed to me and said, "Your Majesty, you must not go in there. It will kill you." And I said, "No, he will not." When I stepped in, the bull knelt down at my feet. And for once, I understood the hunger for perfection. His flank was so soft and warm, his breath sweet from the grasses that he ate. I was filled with a yearning. I went to Daedalus, and I told him of my need. He turned his face away so I couldn't see his disgust and horror, but he did as I asked. He built a wooden frame and suspended over that the soft hide of a heifer, a bench within that was padded and easy to maneuver myself onto, and then the form of the heifer with myself hidden inside was wheeled into the enclosure. My son was created in passion and pain. And when the joining was done, I was wheeled out and lay in my bed for days. As my belly began to swell, my husband knew that the bull must be disposed of. So he called for Heracles to come take my beloved away, and he did indeed, and that is another story, not mine to tell. But I put my hands on my belly and could feel life within. I wanted my husband to have none of it, to have none of the joy of seeing me swell, and so I took to the mountains near the city. I walked amongst the stones. I smelled the dust and the wild thyme. I told my son stories of his father and of what his own life might be. When it was near my time, I went back to the city and gave birth to my boy in my husband's castle. When I held my son to my breast and he began to suckle, I gazed into his eyes, so dark and clear, and I began to weep. I wept for all that had been and for all that I knew would be. When Minos first saw his stepson, he tried desperately to see the baby's body and not the bull's head. He tried desperately to touch the soft skin and ignore the snotty nose and the big eyes and the ears that stuck out. He tried desperately to know anything but what this child was. But he failed. The boy's mother held him close and rocked him as if he were an ordinary child, and Minos felt himself disgusted and jealous of the closeness, the affection that she showed to the hideous babe. He watched as the baby learned to walk and then run. He listened as the baby's mother sung to it. His own wife never sang to him like that. And he knew that something must be done. Minos went to Daedalus and told Daedalus that he needed him to build a maze, a labyrinth, so that when the Minotaur was a man, was grown, it could be locked within, because surely this would be a monstrous beast. And Daedalus agreed. The boy grew. He tried to please everyone. All he wanted was to have no one run from him. His hands could hold a stylus or a sword, but with the shape of his head and his eyes set on the side, he could not use them. He tried to dance and play with the other children, but the other children could not hide their expressions of disgust. And even when ordered to stay and play with him, they would run away. The boy ate fine foods, but all he wanted was grass and leaves and the green growing things of the world, of which there were not many on Crete. He tried to speak, tried to sing, but all that came out from his mouth were bellows. Daedalus studied the tracing of veins in a leaf. He looked at the curls of a snail's shell and at the tracing of slime it left behind. He watched the way that storm clouds writhed one upon the other high above, and he considered what he might do. When his plans were drawn, he had teams of workmen brought to him, each team working on a different section of the labyrinth. It took many years, but eventually it was finished. Daedalus was pleased with his work. It was perhaps the most beautiful and difficult thing he had ever built. He told King Minos that it was done. The Minotaur, now a man's body and a great bull's head with the long horns of a fully grown bull, was told that a castle had been built for him. His stepfather led him to it, and his heart beat rapidly as he thought, "Oh, my stepfather hates me no more. He is giving me a gift." He stepped inside, and the door closed with a click behind him, and he knew what had happened, that he was locked in, and he bellowed out his rage. Minos draped his arm around Daedalus, thanked him for his work, told Icarus, Daedalus' son, to come with him, that there were things that must be said, rewards that must be given. And the three walked up the stairs in a tower until they came to a room at the top. It was lavish. Tiled floors, fine, comfortable furniture, beautiful textiles, food on a platter more beautiful than any food Daedalus and Icarus had ever eaten there before, toys for the boy, a table upon which Daedalus could work. It was everything they might have wanted. They stepped inside, their eyes wide, Daedalus smiling at Icarus. Maybe now his boy would be content, when they heard the door click closed behind them. And Daedalus knew what had happened. He banged upon the door, yelling for Minos, and Minos said, "You may have anything you want. Fine foods, lovers, musicians, anything you need, but you and your son will never leave this room again. You are the only one who knows the complete pattern of the labyrinth. You should be grateful I didn't have you killed. You will live out the rest of your life here." And then Daedalus heard Minos' footsteps going down the stairs. He tried to remain angry, but in truth he was the kind of man with a place to work, to be uninterrupted, to have a fine view of the sea, to have books that he could rely upon, scrolls he could rely upon. That was enough for him. And for a time all was well. Sweet fruits were brought to them, fine wine, delicious meats. The boy played with the toys and gazed out the window, and Daedalus worked. And for a while he thought that perhaps this was the life he had been born to lead. But then he noticed how Icarus would lean out the window and watch the people walking down below, how he would call down to them in the hopes that they would call back, but his voice was always lost in the wind. He watched how his beloved son gazed out into the distance and began to speak less and less and smiled no more. And Daedalus knew that while this might be a life for him, for his boy, it would never be enough. And Daedalus began to plan. He gathered feathers from the pigeons that roosted on the windows. He gathered them together, and he put out bits of meat to draw larger birds closer. Vultures came, and he grabbed them and took their feathers too, and lay the feathers out on the floor in the shape of wings. He had thread and wax and boards brought to him, and began to build wings upon a frame. He tied the feathers oh so carefully to every single bit of the structure, sealed them there with wax. He put them on his own shoulders and felt the wind move as he flapped his wings, and he knew that they would work. When both pair of wings was complete, he said to his son, "Come now, Icarus, it is time." He tied his own wings on and tied wings on to his son, and he said, "I will leap first, and then you must follow me. I know you are afraid you will fall, but you will not. Just move your arms like so, and the wings will catch air, and we will fly. Minos controls the land and the water, so we will be as if it will be as if we are birds, and we will fly away from this prison, and all will be well. You must not fly too high, lest the sun melt the wax. You must not fly too low, lest the sea spray dampen the feathers too much. But you are a good boy. I know that you will be fine." And Daedalus stepped onto the edge of the window. He looked at his son, one last glance in case he was wrong, and stepped out into the air. For a moment he felt himself flying, but then he beat his arms, oh, the pain in his shoulders at first, while he pushed against the air, and the wings caught, and he began to soar up and up, higher and higher, and he banged around to see his son standing there at the edge of the window. His son looked at him, and he looked at the boy, and the boy stepped out and began to fly. He had never been so proud of his son, so full of, of delight, of gratitude that the boy trusted him so. And they flew away from the prison on the island of Crete. Flying was amazing. They both soared over the water. They could see the dolphins arcing through the waves. They passed islands and saw people there at the beach looking at them, pointing, gasping in amazement. They held out their arms and floated on the thermals. It was exquisite for the first hour, or two, or three. They flew hour after hour after hour. They flew as far as they could, 100 miles away from Crete, over the ocean and up in the air. And the boy grew bored. And so he did what not only boys, but you or I might begin to do. He was curious. And so he began to see what he could do with his wings, and soon he found that he could soar up high, feel the sunlight warm on his skin, and then dive down to the ocean, skimming along the surface, startling the dolphins and the flying fish who splatted back into the water in shock. And then he could soar up again and fall, and it felt so good, so alive. He didn't hear, or perhaps did not listen to his father calling to him, "Do not go so high, the wax will melt. Do not go so low, the water will drag you under." Because Icarus in that moment was so alive, so full of what it was to be. And it was when he was high up in the sky, the sunlight warm on his skin, that the wax gave way and the feathers began to shower down. And at first he did not realize that he was falling, because sometimes to fall is also to fly. And when he hit the water, it was harder than the surface of the earth, the ground itself. Daedalus saw his boy fly. He saw the feathers floating on the water, saw the curious dolphins picking them up in their mouths and diving deep, and wept because his son was no more. The salt of his tears fell off of his face into the salty sea and disappeared, and he flew. Daedalus flew, his heart broken, and finally landed on Sparta. And there he shed his wings and burned them on the beach, never to fly again. He found himself a small home, and there he was known as a strange man who never came to the village but to buy a little bit of food. Instead, he stayed in his house crafting small figures, never again to build anything big. The figure of a young man clutching healing herbs. The figure of another young man with a scroll and a stylus. The figure of a man's body and bull's head, and one of a boy with wings. And once they were made, he made them so that the tiny figure with the herbs, with the touch of a button, would extend its hand as if it were an offering. And with a touch of a button, the one with the stylus and the scroll would draw on the paper. And with a touch, the one with the bull's head would bellow out a great sound. And with a touch, the boy's wings would flap. And then he would set them aside and make them again, saying as he carved the wood so carefully into the healer and the builder and the minotaur and the boy, I am sorry, I am sorry, I am sorry. My name is Asterion. It means the one who sees the stars. My mother named me that because when I was born and at her breast, she looked into my dark eyes and saw the reflection of the night sky. She said I was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen, and I believed her. She loved me. She played with me. She taught me how to do things. She was so patient when trying to help my fingers grasp a pencil, and she sang to me. I sang with her, and she never told me that my voice was only a bellow. I tried to play with other children, to do the things that they did, but they would not play with me. The world was different through my eyes, and so I couldn't do the things that they wanted to do. I could not see as they saw. I saw more with my eyes, but they didn't care. They didn't want to know. My stepfather mostly ignored me. I think he was as afraid of me as any of the others. I tried to make him proud. I tried to learn to fight with a sword, but it wasn't enough. When I was a young man, I was told that my stepfather had built me a castle. And I was so happy. Finally, he saw me. He saw that I was not just some monstrous creation with the body of a man and the head of a bull, but that I was someone worthy of my own home, worthy of his attention. And so I followed him placidly as he led me to the door and pushed me in and closed the door behind me. I heard it click shut. And I knew where I was. This was no castle. This was my prison. I bellowed out my heartache. I am sure outside they thought it was rage. It was enormous, full of twistings and turnings. In its own way, it was very beautiful. Daedalus was a master craftsman. The walls met edge to edge perfectly. There were mosaics here and there of great beauty. The sunlight would shine down into courtyards, and in those courtyards I could smell wild oregano growing and little white flowers of such beauty. It didn't take me long to know every corner and curve of the labyrinth. It was beautiful, but I was alone. I did my best to pass the time, thinking perhaps my stepfather would release me someday. And so I learned the twistings and turnings, and I began to draw on the walls with stones I picked up from the ground. I tried to sing, but even to my ear, I knew it was little more than a long, plaintive low, as if, well, as if I were what I appeared to be. It was a desperately lonely time. And then I heard the door open. I ran to the door to see if they were letting me out, but instead I saw 9 young men and 9 young women stumble in, looking terrified, and I thought, companions! They have brought me friends, and so I ran towards them, my arms open, calling out my delight, which I suppose sounded little different than a bellow of sorrow or rage. And they saw me and were terrified and ran. I tried to chase after them, but they ran so fast, they were so fleet of foot, and I thought perhaps if I could find just one to be my friend. And so I walked slowly through the labyrinth, and the first one that I had found a sharp shard of stone, and rather than have to confront me, they took their own life. I carried them to one of the courtyards and buried them. Gradually, I found all of them dead by their own hands, by thirst, by fighting with each other, dead of fear. I buried them all. I wept at their graves. I sang for them as best I could. I planted oregano on their graves and thyme and the little flowers. I visited them. And time passed. And then again the door opened, and again they were let in, and this time I hid. I didn't want to frighten them. But they too all died. I began to wonder if outside they were telling stories that I needed to eat human meat. Why else would they be sending them in if they were not to be my friends? I can eat only grass and thorns and petals. My mouth is not made for chewing flesh. Why would they tell such stories of me? And time passed, and again the door opened. 17 of them fled and died. One of them, Theseus, walked through my home with great certainty. He walked until he found me in one of the courtyards, and when he saw me, he did not run. I thought, finally, someone has come to be my friend, and I opened my arms to show him I meant no harm. I opened my arms to embrace him. And when he ran to me, I ran to him, thinking, finally, someone will touch me in kindness. And I wrapped my arms around him, weeping with relief and joy. And it was only then that I felt the piercing pain and saw my own blood. And then I knew no more. Now I am in the underworld. This place suits me. I am at last at home. I am lonely no more. I am one among others. I wait for the newcomers at the edge of the river. And when they arrive, they see me, and they are not frightened of me. I am just one monster. They have seen far worse. And I tell them I will walk with them and show them what they need to see. And we walk and talk. And if they are frightened, I sing to them. Here I can sing. Finally, I can sing.